Hitler did something every night. He got his advisors and he talked till 2 in the morning. He rambled, and they published a lot of those transcripts. They had a secretary typing them, the Fuhrer's ideas, and it's called Table Talk. He said in one of his last conversations, if I had won the war, I would have shot Roosevelt and I would have shot Churchill, but I would not have shot Stalin, even though I invaded Russia. And because he basically he killed 20 million people. He knew how to knock some heads around, and he was a socialist. And I was a socialist myself. But even though they hated each other because he called him a Jewish Bolshevik. But the other thing and very important is one of the modern strains of anti-Semitism comes from the fact that Marx was Jewish
Oh, wow.
and Trotsky was probably Jewish. And the Bolsheviks came in and said, we're not going to have any of the prejudice and the anti-Semitism of the Tsardom, and we're going to let women and emancipate we need every new person we can. And of course, for a while it worked, and Jews who had been subject to pogrom and everything became very visible. And then all of a sudden, Hitler, who was opposed to this Bolshevism, coined the word Jewish Bolshevism and Marxist Bolshevism, Jewish Bolshevism. And so then that came in with this slur that, well, the Jews are always, they're money lenders and they have all this money and they're always behind something. So there's a cabal of Jews that took over communism. And the fact was they were persecuted terribly by eventually. Stalin said he didn't like Jews. They were persecuted. They were by 1940, if you were Jewish, you were not going to have a prominent position in the Communist Party. But it was the old idea that after the destruction, of Jerusalem and the diaspora of Jews from the first century AD for the next 100, 200, 300 years into the dark ages of modern Europe, Jews were in many countries were not the aristocracy based on land. So they were not allowed to buy land. They were not allowed to have titles. They were called secretive and cabal. But one thing happened. They because they were forced to, they understood a mercantile, monetized economy that appeared, especially during the Industrial Revolution. So when they needed people with expertise, suddenly banking, finance, insurance, the people who had no recourse to specialize in these disreputable positions. They didn't have estates, they didn't have titles,
Right.
they were the experts. So they started to name them silver and gold, Goldstein silver, satin, all of these names of pejorative names. But then they became very adroit at it, and they couldn't win because at first they weren't allowed to do all the things that had prestige. So they did the things that had no prestige, and they got good at it. And then the things that had no prestige, as the modern era started to develop, they were the experts. And then they were damned as a cabal and secretive and money
Oh my
obsessed and
gosh.
everything.
So hold on, let me get this straight. You're telling me that because they weren't allowed to hold positions of power, they weren't allowed to be lords and ladies, they weren't allowed to hold land, they were forced into trade and this mercantile business and lending money and learning this craft, but then that ended up being what made them so wildly successful and powerful. And then
As the
people,
economy started to change, modern economy started to emerge out of Europe that was not based necessarily just on land. And there was no connection between, there used to be, there still is in Europe to an extent, but their prestige came from birth, ancestry, land, not money. Money was static, but when the economy started to industrialize and it started to be globalized in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, especially, then people who had been dabbling and the only thing they could do, trading diamond. That's why, the real anti-Semite will always say, well, that guy's name is Diamond. That guy's name is Satin. That guy's
Goldstein,
name is
right,
Gold. That guy's
right.
name is Silverstein. And they don't understand why those names came up. They were not adopted by Jews. They were adopted by Gentiles as last names that were pejorative when they were in Europe. And so the
Oh,
other thing was the old cabal was that
wow.
since Roman times, every conquered people were given habeas corpus. The Gauls, the Spaniards, the Iberians, anybody, all you had to do was say, I respect the divinity of the emperor from, say, 100 AD to 500 AD.
Okay.
When they went into Judea, the Jews alone would say, we're not even going to go through the rituals. They said to the Jews, you can believe whatever you want, but just say for public purposes
Bend the knee.
that yes, Vespasian or Titus or Domitian is God. And they said no. So then they destroyed the second temple, and they were scattered from Judea.
Right.
Some stayed, but they were sent all over the empire. And that's why they never really were cohesive. And the way they maintained their culture was to be adamant about their religion. And then, of course, Christianity had the ancient smear. You kind of saw that a little bit when Tucker was talking. I don't know if he meant it to. I think he knew what he was doing when he taught at
The
Charlie
hummus
Kirk's
thing?
memorial. When he
Yes.
said, yes, he said there's a
Sitting
bunch of
around eating
people.
hummus. Yeah.
And that was an allusion to the Pharisees in the back room that were supplying Pilate with information about Jesus and basically saying, if you kill him, we'll be happy and we can cooperate with you. That was the ancient slur, that they were Christ killers, because Jesus was going to overthrow Judaism and the Pharisees and the hierarchy and create a new religion that was not based on being Jewish, but anybody could be Christian. And so that was the slur, along with money making. They
Wow.
control Hollywood.
Yes.
They
Jealousy,
control the
envy.
banking. Yes.
Right. All right, guys, if you like this clip and you want to watch the full episode, click here. And if you want more content like this, you can subscribe to the show by clicking here.